The seal had been on my wrist since before I could remember clearly. That was the nature of it, the counselors told me, when I was young enough to still ask questions. A binding of that depth did not leave its subject fully intact. There were things I had forgotten. There were things I had never been allowed to keep. The Council of Seals was very precise about what a king needed and what he did not, and memory, certain kinds of memory, fell into the second category. I accepted this. For a long time I accepted almost everything. I was Rael of Valdrenoth, Alpha King of the Stone Fortress and the Great Grey Vaults, ruler of the pack that lived and worked in its shadow, and I had governed well. My records said so. The counselors said so. The court that attended my table each evening said so, in the careful, studied tones of people who have learned that a sealed king is still a king, and that a king's displeasure, even a muted one, is not something to court. My wolf was quiet. It had always been quiet, for as long as I could remember. A low, steady presence behind my ribs, like an ember banked so low it gave no light. The counselors had told me this was normal. That stability in a king required a wolf that did not surge, did not push, did not destabilize the binding with impulse or appetite. For a century, I believed them. I will tell you what a century of that feels like, because it matters. It feels like ruling with one hand. It feels like hearing music from behind a closed door and knowing, on some level you cannot name, that you once knew the song. You function, you lead. You make decisions, and they are sound decisions, and the pack under your care does not suffer. But there is a hollowness in the center of your chest that you have learned not to look at directly, the way you do not look directly at a lamp when the light has gone to almost nothing. Looking does not help. The hollowness simply is. You rule around it. I told myself this was the price of order. The council was very good at that framing. A king unchecked by the seal was a king whose wolf might surge at the wrong moment, might form attachments that fractured alliances, might make decisions from the gut rather than the ledger. The seal was a gift, they said. Clarity, control. I believed them because what else does a man believe when the believing is all he has left? I went down to the archive on the 43rd day of the frost season, 2 years into my second century of rule. I went because a land deed from the Eastern Pack territories had been filed incorrectly 12 seasons prior, and the error had surfaced in a boundary dispute that could not wait. A simple matter. The kind of thing I usually sent a steward for, but the counselor who managed the Eastern accounts had died in the autumn, and his replacement had not yet been confirmed, and I found that morning that I had no patience for the intermediate channels. I wanted to see the record myself. I took the long stairs down into the stone. The archive of Valdrenoth was one of the oldest rooms in the fortress. It ran the length of the eastern foundation, low vaulted and cold even in summer, smelling of beeswax and iron gall, and the particular dry paper scent of records that had not been disturbed in decades. The candlelight down there was amber and very steady, because the deep stone had no drafts, and the rows of wooden shelving rose from floor to ceiling along both walls, packed with ledgers and deed rolls and sealed correspondence going back 400 years. It was, by any measure, the most complete archive in the Northern Territories. I had visited it perhaps twice in a century. I did not know anyone worked there alone. I found the land deed section in the eastern wing, which required navigating 2 turnings and a narrow connecting passage, and it was in that passage, barely wide enough for 2 people abreast, that I nearly walked into her. She was carrying a stack of records, old ones by the look of them, their spines faded to a uniform gray, their edges soft with age. She had them balanced against her chest with both arms, and she had been moving at an archivist's careful pace, watching her footing on the uneven stone, and she did not see me until I was already in the passage ahead of her. She stopped. The stack of records wobbled. She caught them with the competent economy of someone who had caught falling records many times before. She said very quietly, "Forgive me, I did not hear," and then looked up and saw who I was and stopped speaking. I should have stepped aside and let her pass and continued to the land deed section. That was what the moment called for. She was clearly an archivist. I was clearly the king on an administrative errand. The corridor was narrow. The polite action was to press myself to one side of the passage and let her through. Instead, I did not move. I am not certain I could have explained why, in that first moment. It was not her appearance precisely, though she was quietly striking in the way that people are when they are too absorbed in their actual work to have considered being striking. She was dressed in the plain gray linen of the archive staff, her dark hair pinned back with the kind of economy that suggested she had not thought about it past utility, and her eyes, when they found my face, were a clear, uncommon gold that I had not seen before and could not immediately look away from. It was not that. It was my wrist. The seal was there, as it had always been, a tracery of dark lines worked into the skin just below my pulse, the mark of the binding the council had laid on me at the beginning of my rule. 100 years and it had not shifted. It had not warmed. It had not done anything but sit there like a brand, a reminder of the terms under which I had been permitted to govern. In the passage, with this archivist 3 feet from me, the sleeve of her robe brushed the back of my wrist as she steadied her stack of records. And the seal cracked. Not visibly, not with any sound, but I felt it, a fine fracture running through something that had been solid so long I had forgotten it was a constructed thing, and not simply my own skin. The hollowness in my chest moved. The banked ember behind my ribs shifted, and for one disorienting instant I felt my wolf, not the muted, distant thing I had grown accustomed to, but something much larger, something awake, something that turned its full attention toward the woman in front of me with a focus I had not felt in a century. Then the moment passed. The fracture sealed itself, or mostly sealed itself, or seemed to. The sleeve had moved. She had adjusted her grip on her records and taken a half step back to give me room, and she was looking at me with the expression of someone who is not certain whether they have done something wrong. "I have not disturbed your records," she said carefully. "The Eastern land deeds are 3 shelves past the connecting door. I can show you if—" "What is your name?" I asked. She blinked. "Sova, my lord, I keep the archive." "Alone?" "There are 2 others," she said, "but they manage the correspondence vault on the upper level. The deep records are my section." I looked at her for a moment that was longer than a king ought to spend looking at a records keeper in a narrow passage. She did not look away. There was a self-possession about her that was not performance, not the careful composure of someone who has learned to perform composure before powerful people, but something quieter, something that lived in her the way the stillness lived in the deep archive around her. "Show me the Eastern land deeds," I said. She led me through the connecting door and 3 shelves down and found the record without hesitation, pulling it from its place with the practiced ease of someone who knows exactly where every document in her care has been filed. She handed it to me and stood at a respectful distance while I read it, and I read it, and I found what I had come for, and I stayed in the archive for another 2 hours. I told myself it was because the adjacent records were relevant. They were not particularly relevant, but I had not lied to myself about the hollowness in my chest for a century, and I was not going to start now. I stayed because my wolf, that muted and banked thing, had turned its face toward the sound of her moving through the stacks and would not turn away. I returned to the archive the following morning. This time I brought a pretext, a question about the old territorial surveys, and she answered it without giving any sign that she found my presence unusual, because she was the kind of woman who received whatever came into her domain and accommodated it with the same quiet competence. She found the survey. She answered the question. She then went back to whatever she had been doing before I arrived, which was cataloging a section of deed rolls that appeared to have been misfiled sometime in the previous century. And I sat at the long table near the eastern wall and did not particularly look at her, and felt the seal on my wrist ache with a pressure it had not had yesterday. Not pain, pressure. The way a door aches when there is a great deal of weight on the other side of it. On the third visit I brought nothing. No pretext, no question, no administrative matter. I came down the long stairs at the hour when the fortress above was sitting down to the midday meal, and I found Sova at her table with her own meal spread beside her, bread, a wedge of hard cheese, a cup of something warm, eating with one hand while she wrote with the other, and she looked up when I came in and said, "There are no new surveys, my lord." "I know," I said. A pause. "Then is there something else I can help you find?" I sat down at the long table across from her. The candlelight was amber and steady between us. She watched me for a moment with those clear gold eyes, then went back to her writing, and I sat in the silence of the deep archive and tried to understand what was happening in my own chest. My wolf was no longer simply turned toward her. It was learning her, in the way that wolves learn, not through observation exactly, not the deliberate cataloging of detail, but through some older and more particular kind of attention, the kind that maps a person at a depth below language. I knew, though she had not told me, that she came to the archive before dawn. I knew that she did not eat until her work had found its natural pause point, that she never forced an ending. I knew that she moved through the stacks with the particular care of someone who understood that the things in her keeping could not be replaced, and that this care was not professional fastidiousness, but something that came from a genuine conviction that the forgotten deserved to be kept. I knew all of this, and I had known her for 3 days. The seal ached. "How long have you worked in the archive?" I asked. She did not look up. 11 years, my lord." "And before that?" A slight pause. "I came from the Eastern Settlement. I was placed here by the Archive Commission when I was 20. "You were born in Valdranoth." Another pause, fractionally longer. "I do not know precisely where I was born," she said. "There was some difficulty with my records, I understand. The commission told me that the originals were lost." Something moved through me that was not quite a chill. Lost. She turned a page. "It happens with old records, particularly from the Eastern Settlement." She said it with a steadiness that suggested she had long since made her peace with the gap, or had at least made a home in it. I said nothing else about it. But that night in my chambers above the stone, I lay awake and listened to the seal on my wrist and thought about records that had been lost, and whether the Archive Commission, which fell under the Council of Seals, had ever been asked to lose anything before. I went back the 4th day, and the 5th, and I stopped inventing reasons. On the 5th visit, Sova had the kettle on when I arrived, and she poured 2 cups without being asked, and set one at my end of the table and said nothing. And I understood this to be its own kind of welcome, the only kind that a woman of her particular dignity would extend without being certain it was wanted, and it was more welcome than I had been offered in a very long time. On the 7th visit she was standing on a tall stepladder in the western stacks, reaching for a record on the highest shelf, and she misjudged her grip and the record tipped backward, and in catching it she lost her balance, and I was across the archive floor, and at the base of the ladder before I had consciously decided to move, and she caught herself on the shelf with one hand and the record with the other, and did not fall, but the ladder swayed, and my hand came up and closed around her ankle to steady it. She looked down at me. I looked up at her. "I had it," she said. "I know," I said, and did not move my hand. The seal on my wrist, the one below where my fingers had closed around her ankle, burned with a heat so sudden and so specific that I made a sound that was not suited to a king. And Sova came down off the ladder very quickly, because my face apparently told her something that the rest of me had not caught up to yet. "My lord," she looked at my wrist. The tracery of dark lines was lit from within, faintly, the way iron glows when it has been held too long in the fire. "What is that?" "The seal," I said. "I can see it is the seal. Why is it doing that?" "I am not entirely certain," I said, which was the most honest thing I had said to anyone in a very long time. but I think it is because of you." She looked at me for a long moment. She had the record held against her chest, the way she had held the stack in the corridor on the first day, and her gold eyes were very steady, and underneath the steadiness I could see something she would not quite name, a recognition that had no context yet, a feeling she had lived with so long she had stopped expecting it to have a source. "I have never touched the seal," she said. "Your sleeve touched my wrist," I said, "the first day in the passage." She remembered it. I watched her remember it. "And ever since then?" she asked. "Ever since then." She set the record down very carefully on the nearest shelf, as if she needed her hands free. Then she looked at the seal on my wrist and at me and said, in a voice so quiet it barely disturbed the candle-lit air, "I have felt hollow for 11 years. I told myself it was the archive, the deep stone, the cold. I stopped mentioning it because there was nothing to be done about it." "Hollow," I said. "Yes." A pause, like I had misplaced something important and could not remember what it was. I held out my wrist. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she reached out and laid her fingers very gently over the tracery of dark lines. The world changed. It did not change in the way that the counselors had told me binding breaks worked. They had told me, in the early years when I had asked what would happen if the seal were disrupted, that a partial break would destabilize the king, would send the wolf into dangerous agitation, would require immediate reinstatement. They had told me this with the particular calm of people who are very sure the thing they are describing will never happen. They had been wrong. When Sova's fingers touched the seal, the fracture I had felt in the passage on the first day opened completely, and at once, like a door that has been held shut by one hand and that hand finally moved. The darkness that had been behind it came through all at once, not darkness exactly, not anything as simple as darkness. It came through as memory, as warmth, as the return of something I did not know I had been without until it was back, and it was so sudden and so total that I had to sit down on the archive floor because my legs did not survive it. My wolf was not an ember anymore. It was a tide, a full, present, enormous thing, alive behind my ribs the way it should always have been, the way it had been before the seal was laid, and it knew her. It knew her the way it knows things below language, not as a fact, not as a conclusion reached from evidence, but as a certainty that lived in the oldest part of what I was. She was mine. She had been mine before the seal was laid, which meant before I had been permitted to know her, which meant the council had spent 100 years keeping this from me on purpose, and the mate mark on my wrist, which I had believed was a component of the binding, blazed gold with a heat that was not the seal's muted authority, but something far older and entirely its own. On Sova's wrist, the same mark blazed. She looked at it with an expression that was not surprise precisely. Surprise would have required her to have had no expectation at all, and she had been hollow for 11 years in the precise shape of something missing. She knew what that shape was now. "Oh," she said softly. "Yes," I said from the floor. She sat down across from me, on the cold archive stone, and did not seem to notice the cold. We looked at each other in the amber candlelight, and the mate mark burned steady gold on both our wrists, and the wolf that had been mute for a century was making a sound in my chest that was not a sound but a homecoming, a long and terrible homecoming that was also the best thing I had ever felt. "The council knew," I said. I was piecing it together as I spoke, because the memories that were coming back were not crisp or sequential. They were coming back the way a tide brings things, tumbled and out of order and sudden, and some of them were going to take a long time to sort. But this much was clear. They sealed my wolf to make me controllable, and they erased you to make the seal hold. A mated king's wolf cannot be bound. The bond is stronger than any working the council can lay. So they took you out of the records. They put you in the archive and called you a nobody and made sure I would never come down here. I came down here 11 years ago," she said. I was told the Archive Commission chose me for the placement. The Archive Commission answers to the Council. She absorbed this. She was very good at absorbing difficult information. She did it the way she did everything, with a stillness that was not absence but the opposite, a full and present receiving. They hid me from you, she said. And me from myself, I said. A silence. Not the silence of the deep archive, which had been my companion for all of 7 visits and her companion for 11 years. A different silence, one that was alive in it, that was the two of us sitting in the rubble of a century of carefully constructed misdirection, and acknowledging it together. I have felt hollow, she said again quietly, for 11 years. I have felt hollow, I said, for a century. She looked at me then, a long look, gold eyes steady, the mate mark on her wrist still burning, and something moved in her face that was not sentiment, but it was very close to something that had no colder name. We should probably not continue to sit on the archive floor, she said. Probably, I agreed. She stood first, and then offered me her hand, and I took it, and when I stood the gold of the mate mark ran up both our wrists, and the wolf in my chest was so present and so certain that it was nearly a sound. I held her hand for longer than necessary. She did not take it back. I want to tell you what it was to have my wolf return to me, because I think anyone who has not lived a century under a binding cannot understand what I mean when I say it was like learning to see again. It was not simply that the muted ember became a fire. It was that the fire knew things, felt things, responded to the world in ways that the sealed version of me had not been permitted to. I walked back up the long stairs from the archive with Sova beside me, and the world was different in every way that mattered. The stone was colder. The light was brighter. The sounds of the fortress above, the cook fires, the voices, the distant hammering from the forge were vivid and specific in a way they had not been in 100 years. And she was beside me. My wolf tracked her presence the way a compass tracks north, not frantically, not as obsession, but as simple orientation, as the acknowledgement that this was the direction the world was most itself, that this was where it was not hollow. I had about 4 hours before I needed to face the council. I spent them in my study, going through the archive records I had taken from the deep stacks, the ones that told me what I needed to know. The dossier on Sova, the real one, not the thin placement record the Archive Commission had given her, was in a locked sub-vault 3 levels below her own stacks, and she had found the key in the catalog of sealed documents and brought the dossier up herself while I went to my study, because she was not a woman who waited to understand her own story once the means of understanding it were within reach. She brought it to me 2 hours later and laid it on my desk, and I read it while she stood at the window and looked out over the gray fortress and the frost-pale fields beyond. The dossier was meticulous. The council always was. It detailed every step of the process. The identification of the mate bond, which had been flagged by the binding master at the initial laying of the seal, because a king who had found his fated mate before the seal was laid could not be fully bound without severing the bond, and severing the bond was not something even the Council of Seals was willing to attempt, because a wolf king whose mate bond had been severed was not a controlled king, he was a dangerous one. So they had done the next best thing. They had taken her out of his reach, erased her from the records that he had access to, placed her in the archive, which was, technically, within the fortress, which fulfilled the requirement of the placement, but buried her so deep in the administrative structure that there was no realistic mechanism by which a king would encounter her. And then they had told him the muting was normal, that the quiet wolf was stable, that this was what health looked like for a bound king. 100 years. She had been 3 levels below me for 11 years. She had kept the deep archive in careful order for 11 years, not knowing what she was waiting for, feeling hollow without understanding the shape of the hollowness. And before the 11 years, before the placement, she had been elsewhere, just as carefully kept out of my path. The dossier cataloged 17 different arrangements across the span of the century, each one designed to ensure that the fated mate of the Alpha King of Valdrenoth remained perpetually accessible to the administrative machine that needed to maintain the fiction of her existence, while remaining perpetually inaccessible to the king himself. I looked up from the dossier. Sova was still at the window. 17, I said. She turned. They moved you 17 times, I said. Over a century. Every time there was any chance of proximity, they reassigned you, until they ran out of places to put you and settled on the archive because it was the one location in the fortress they were certain I would never visit voluntarily. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I remember 11 moves. I was told each time that the reassignment was for administrative reasons. It was, I said, the administration of my binding. She nodded once, absorbing. I would like to see the council, she said. Not for any reason in particular. I would simply like them to have to look at me while they know that I know. I thought this was a very reasonable thing to want. I told her so. The Council of Seals met in the Seal Hall on the 4th floor of the Eastern Tower, a room that was precisely designed to impress the necessity of the council upon anyone who entered it. Tall ceilings, the 8 great seals of the founding charter mounted on the northern wall, candlelight from a chandelier of such size that it took 4 men to lower it for relighting. I had sat in this room for 100 years and received the council's guidance and thanked them for it, and I had believed, for most of that time, that their guidance was in my interest. I brought Sova with me. I did not announce her role. I walked into the Seal Hall at the hour of the evening session, and I sat in the Alpha King's chair, and she stood at my right hand, which was not a position that the evening session provided for, and I watched the 5 counselors absorb this. They were very good at not reacting visibly. It was a skill the position selected for. But the senior counselor, a man named Dravet, who had held the position for longer than I could verify because the council maintained its own records, separately from the archive. Dravet looked at Sova, and then at my wrist, and the very small control he lost in the second before he recovered it told me everything I needed to confirm. He had known, they had all known. My lord, Dravet said, we were not aware this was a full session. We are not prepared for. You are prepared for whatever I require you to be prepared for, I said pleasantly. Sit down. They sat. I placed the dossier on the table between us. I had marked the key sections, the binding master's original notation, the 17 reassignment orders, the Archive Commission placement directive, with the notation bond threat to the seal, contact with subject to be prevented written in Dravet's own hand in the margin, 11 years ago. Dravet looked at it. The other counselors looked at Dravet. I would like to understand, I said, at what point the Council of Seals understood itself to have the authority to arrange the permanent concealment of the Alpha King's fated mate from the Alpha King himself. No one answered. I will help you, I said. The answer is that it did not have that authority, not under the founding charter, not under any instrument of governance I am aware of. The founding charter grants the council the right to advise the king on matters of pact stability and to administer the binding seal in the event that a king requests it. The king did not request it. The king was not consulted. The king was 17 years old and had not found his mate, and the council saw an opportunity to create a more manageable ruler, and it took that opportunity, and it has been maintaining that opportunity for a century. Dravet said, very carefully, the binding was undertaken for the stability of Valdrenoth. The binding, I said, was undertaken for the stability of the council. A silence. The 8 great seals on the northern wall caught the candlelight. The mate bond's dissolution of the seal is, Dravet said, after a moment, in the tone of a man playing his last piece, technically. Not a dissolution, I said. The seal is already dissolved. It dissolved in the archive 4 hours ago. I'm not here to ask your permission for what has already occurred. I'm here to tell you what occurs next. I looked at each of them in turn. The binding is ended. The mate bond is recognized. The woman at my right hand is Sova, the Alpha King's fated mate, and she will be acknowledged as his Luna before the full court tomorrow evening. The dossier and all supporting documentation will be transferred to the archive for permanent record. I looked at Dravit specifically. Your notation in the margin will be included. Dravit said nothing. There was nothing to say. The seal was gone. The authority of the council rested, ultimately, on the bound king's acceptance of their counsel, and the bound king was no longer bound. I stood. Sova stood straight beside me. She had stood straight throughout, with the same archive keeper's composure she carried everywhere, but there was something in it now that had not been there before, or rather, something that had always been there and was now not required to be quiet. A steadiness that was not merely managed but sovereign. She knew what she was. She had known for 4 hours, and she wore it the way she wore everything, without performance, without need for the room to confirm it. She looked at Dravit. He looked back at her. Whatever he had expected a century-concealed fated mate to be, whatever he had believed she would amount to, buried in the deep archive among the forgotten documents, she was not that. She met his eyes with the gold gaze that had held mine in the narrow passage, unafraid, unhurried, entirely present, and Dravit, the senior counselor of the seal, looked away first. We left the seal hall. The door closed behind us. In the corridor, which was cold and lit by a pair of small torches, I let out a long breath. "Well," I said. "Yes," she said. "You were very steady in there." "I keep records," she said. "I am accustomed to situations in which the truth is not comfortable for the people responsible for it." I looked at her. The mate mark on my wrist was steady gold now, not blazing, just present the way my wolf was present, not surging, just fully itself. I had been afraid, on the walk up from the archive, that the return of the wolf would be overwhelming, that a century of suppression might leave something raw or unstable. It did not feel that way. It felt like the return of my own hand. Natural, correct, the instrument of myself that should never have been taken away. "You have been in the archive for 11 years, I said. "And before that, for close to a century, the council arranged your life so that I would not find you. I want you to understand that I intend to spend some considerable time making up for that." She looked at me for a moment, and there was something in her face that was not quite the quiet composure of the archive keeper. It was something warmer than that, and less controlled, the look of someone who has spent a very long time holding something back and has just been given permission not to. "That is a significant thing to promise," she said. "I am an Alpha King," I said. "My promises bind." "You just finished explaining that bindings can be undone." "The wrong kind," I said. "This kind holds." She looked at me for another moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved, the very smallest movement, but on Sova's carefully composed face it was as expressive as a laugh. "All right," she said, "then I accept." I will tell you what the court looked like, the following evening, when I brought Sova into the great hall for the formal acknowledgement. I want to tell you because it matters, not for any reason of theater, not because I needed the moment witnessed, but because the court of Valdrinoth had been governed for a century by a sealed king, and the thing that had made him sealed was the absence of the woman who was now at his side, and I thought they deserved to understand what that had cost all of them. The great hall was the largest room in the fortress, stone vaulted ceiling, 2 long fire trenches down the center, the table that could seat 200, the Alpha's chair at the head on its low dais. The court was assembled, as it was assembled every evening for the reporting meal, and they did not know, most of them, what the evening session was to contain. The counselors were present because they were required to be present. Dravit sat in his seat near the head of the table and looked at nothing. I entered with Sova beside me. The room read the positioning immediately. That is one of the things courts are good at, the immediate structural reading of who stands where relative to whom. There was a long, settling silence as we moved down the length of the hall. I did not make a speech. I am not a king who makes speeches when the situation does not require them, and this situation did not. I spoke clearly and without ceremony. I told them what the seal had been. I told them what it had done. I told them about the dossier and the 17 reassignment orders, and the notation in the margin and Sova's 11 years in the deep archive. I told them that the seal was dissolved and the mate bond was acknowledged, and that the woman beside me was the Alpha King's fated mate, and that she would be his Luna, and that all records pertaining to her would be corrected and restored and placed at the front of the archive, in acknowledgement that she was the most significant thing the archive had ever housed without knowing it. The court was very quiet. Then I said one other thing. I said that the Council of Seals would be reformed, its charter revised, and its authority over the Alpha line restricted, effective immediately, and that the revision would be drafted by a committee that did not include anyone who had served on the council in the last century, and that the dossier and its documentation would be available in the archive for any member of the court who wished to understand why. Dravit stood up. I looked at him. He sat back down. I turned to Sova. She was looking out at the court, not performing composure now, simply present, in the way she was always present, the gold of the mate mark steady on her wrist, her gray archive linen replaced for the evening with something in deep blue that one of the household staff had found in the time since the afternoon, and she looked like what she was, which was the woman the fortress had been keeping without knowing what it had, the woman the council had spent a century ensuring did not arrive where she belonged. She belonged here. My wolf had known it in the first passage. The seal had known it a century before that, when it had required a 17-year-old king to be bound before he could find her. The mate mark on my wrist, blazing gold in the first moment, steady and permanent now, had known it the way the oldest things know things, below argument and beyond revision. The court began to bow. Not by command, not in response to any instruction. They went down in the gradual, instinctive way that rooms go down before something they recognize, the way the body responds to what the mind has not yet caught up to. Sova saw it and did not reach for composure, because composure was not what she was doing. She was simply standing in it, the way the deep archive had always stood in its cold and amber quiet, receiving what came into its keeping, holding it with care, knowing that the things in its charge were not nothing, had never been nothing, and deserved to be kept. She reached out and took my hand. Her fingers found the mate mark and rested over it, as they had in the archive when the world changed, and the gold of it was steady and warm under her touch, and my wolf was fully present and fully still, the way a wolf is still when it is home. There was a moment, the court bowing, the fire trenches burning, the candlelight amber on stone, and it was the most complete moment I had experienced in a century, because it was the first in a century that had nothing missing from it. After the court session, I went with Sova back to the archive. She wanted to, and I understood why. The deep archive was her domain, the place that had been hers for 11 years, and the evening had been large, and she was a woman who knew herself well enough to understand what she needed after something large. She needed the cold stone and the amber light and the particular smell of old paper and beeswax, and a space that was the right size. I sat at the long table while she moved through the stacks. She was not working. She was walking through her domain the way a person walks through a place they love, touching a spine here, straightening a ledger there, not because it needed straightening, but because the touch was itself a kind of affirmation. I watched her and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said, and I had spent a century in a court that communicated in the careful, studied language of people who know that words are political objects, and the quiet of the archive was the most honest room I had been in for a very long time. After a while she came and sat down at the table across from me. She folded her hands in front of her, the mate mark golden and steady on her wrist. She looked at me. "Tomorrow," she said, "I will need to speak with the household staff about relocating the record sections that were deliberately misfiled to limit my access to the East Vault materials." "That seems reasonable," I said. "And I will need a key to the sub-vault. I will have one made. And the Archive Commission will need to be reorganized. Also part of the council reforms," I said. She nodded. "And you," she said, "will need to have someone explain to you what 100 years of sealed wolf suppression does to a king's governance patterns, because I have read enough administrative history in this archive to understand that a muted wolf does not make better decisions. It makes fewer decisions and calls the reduction in decision stability. And if I am going to be your Luna, I would like to begin by being honest about that." I looked at her for a long moment. "You have been in the archive for 11 years, I said, "and in that time you have developed opinions about the governance of Valdrenoth. I have read every land dispute, boundary negotiation, pact treaty and council directive filed in this archive over the last century," she said. "Yes, I have opinions." "I see. Are you troubled by that?" "No," I said truthfully. "My wolf finds it deeply reassuring." The corner of her mouth moved again. "Good." I reached across the table and covered her folded hands with one of mine. The mate mark on my wrist rested against the mate mark on hers, and the warmth between them was not a blaze now, but something steady and enduring, a thing that had found its permanent level and would hold it, the way the deep archive held its temperature regardless of what happened on the floors above. "I want to ask you something," I said. "Yes." "You said you have felt hollow for 11 years, since you came to the archive." "Yes." "Before that," I said, "in the 17 placements before, did you?" "Yes," she said before I finished. Less clearly. The archive made it worse, I think, because here I was close enough that some part of me knew, but yes, before, always. A silence, the amber candlelight, the cold stone, the deep quiet of the oldest room in the fortress. "I am sorry," I said. "I would not have permitted it if I had known." "I know," she said. "That is why they made sure you did not know." She turned her hands under mine and took my hand properly, the way she had in the Seal Hall corridor and in the Great Hall, the grip of someone who was not performing, who simply knew what she was doing and did it. "It is over now," she said. "Yes," I said. "Then we should probably talk about what comes next instead of what has been." A pause. "I have a great many opinions about what comes next." I looked at her, the archive keeper in her deep blue, the gold-eyed woman who had catalogued the forgotten records of Valdrenoth for 11 years and developed opinions about the governance of kingdoms, and who had sat down on the cold archive floor without appearing to notice the cold when the mate mark blazed, and the sealed king had been too undone to stay upright. And my wolf, fully present and fully awake for the first time in a century, regarded her with the particular certainty of something that has come to rest exactly where it was always going. "Tell me," I said. She did. We sat in the deep archive until the candles had burned low and the cold had deepened in the stone, and she told me everything she had been keeping, not just the governance opinions, though there were many of those, well considered and precisely articulated, but the other things, the smaller things. The names she had given to favorite records, the sections of the archive she loved best, the 11 years of mornings before the rest of the fortress was awake, the particular quality of the amber light at the far end of the eastern stacks in mid-afternoon, the hollow feeling and what she had learned to do with it, and what she had never managed to do with it. And I told her things I had not told anyone, things that a sealed king does not tell people because a sealed king has learned that what he feels is administrative rather than personal, that the hollowness is the cost of stability, that the banked ember is preferable to the fire. The fire was not preferable. The fire was the point. I told her that too. The candles burned low. Neither of us moved to replace them. The next morning, The first morning of what I was going to call, privately, my second life, though 103 years was a long way to reach a first morning. I went to the council chambers alone, before the day session, and I took the wax seals from the founding council instruments off the wall where they had hung for 4 centuries, and I placed them in the brazier that the councilors used to burn correspondence, and I watched them dissolve. It took a long time. Wax seals are thick, and these had been locked in their casings, and they were very old, and the brazier was not large. But I had the patience of a man who has just been returned to himself after a century without himself, and patience was not a problem. Dravot came in halfway through and stood in the doorway and looked at the brazier, and did not say anything. There will be new instruments, I told him, drafted by the Reform Committee. The council will continue in a reduced capacity with an explicit prohibition on any working that affects the Alpha Line or the mate bond. You will be required to sign the new charter or resign the position. He looked at the brazier for another moment. Then he nodded once and left. I watched the last seal dissolve. The wax of 4 centuries melted into nothing, and the bronze casing sat dark and empty in the coals, and above the fortress the frost-pale fields of Valdrinoth were bright with morning, and in the deep archive below, the woman who had kept the forgotten records of this kingdom for 11 years was already at her table, already working, already waiting without knowing she was waiting for me to come back down. I went to her. I would always go to her. That was the simple truth of it, the truth that the seal had been built to prevent, and that no council instrument could alter, because it was not a political truth or an administrative truth but the oldest kind, the kind that lives below both and requires neither. My wolf had known it in a narrow archive corridor on an ordinary errant morning, when a gray sleeve had brushed a sealed wrist, and a fracture had run through 100 years of careful construction. She looked up when I came in. The kettle was already on. "I thought you might come back," she said. "I told you," I said, "this kind of promise holds." She poured 2 cups and set one at my end of the table, and I sat down, and the mate mark on my wrist was warm and steady, and my wolf was home, and the archive was amber and cold and full of the careful quiet of a woman who understood that the things in her keeping deserved to be kept. Outside, Valdrinoth was waking up. For the first time in a century, so was I,